Carol Hensley looked me dead in the eye in front of every person sitting in that HOA meeting room and laughed. Not a polite smile, not a dismissive chuckle, a full, head-tilted back, hand-on-the-table laugh, like I had just told the funniest joke she'd heard all year. And what had I said that was so hilarious? I told her a flood was coming. I told her I had spent 31 years as a civil engineer working Houston's flood control systems, that I had seen what water does when it has nowhere to go, and that our street, Briarwood Glen Court, was sitting in a bowl. I told her I wanted to build a flood wall along my property line, that I had the drawings, the calculations, the city permits, everything she could possibly need to approve my request. And Carol Hensley laughed. Dwight Prute, sitting to her left, shook his head like I was a confused old woman who didn't understand how neighborhoods worked. Susan Albright wouldn't even make eye contact. 3 weeks later, on the morning of September 19th, 2019, I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched Tropical Storm Imelda drop 11 inches of rain on Houston in 6 hours. I watched the water rise. I watched it stop at my flood wall, pool against the concrete, and go nowhere. And then my phone rang. It was Carol. She was crying. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people call me Maggie. I'm 58 years old. I'm a retired civil engineer. I'm a widow, and I have lived in my home at 14 Briarwood Glen Court in Houston, Texas, for the past 9 years. I want to tell you exactly what happened in the summer and fall of 2019 because I think about it still. Not with anger, not anymore. But with the particular clarity that comes from being told you're wrong by people who have no idea what they're talking about, and then being proven right in the most dramatic way that life can arrange. I moved to Briarwood Glen in 2015, 2 years after my husband Robert passed. Robert was also an engineer, structural, not civil, but we used to joke that between the two of us we could build an entire city and then make sure the water drained out of it properly. After he died, I stayed in our old house in Katy for about 18 months, and then I realized I was staying there for the wrong reasons. I wasn't living in that house anymore. I was just maintaining it. So I sold it, and I bought the house on Briarwood Glen Court, which was smaller, newer, and had a backyard with a live oak tree that Robert would have loved. The neighborhood was quiet, mature landscaping, good sidewalks, the kind of place where people walked their dogs in the evening and waved at each other and mostly minded their own business. Mostly. Briarwood Glen Estates had a homeowners association, which I knew going in. I had dealt with HOAs before. I wasn't naive about what they were or how they operated. I attended my first HOA meeting in October 2015, introduced myself, and took my seat. That was the first time I saw Carol Hensley in action, and even then, before I knew her or had any reason to think anything specific about her, something in the way she ran that meeting made me quietly decide I would keep my interactions with her professional and minimal. She was the kind of person who corrected the secretary's grammar during the reading of the previous meeting's minutes. She was the kind of person who had a preferred seating arrangement at a folding table in a community room and would let you know gently but unmistakably if you'd taken her chair. I kept my head down, maintained my property, paid my dues on time, and stayed out of HOA politics for nearly 4 years. That ended in the spring of 2019. Here is what I knew about flooding that Carol Hensley did not. I knew it not from reading articles or watching the news, but from 31 years of showing up to flooded streets, flooded underpasses, flooded neighborhoods, and figuring out where the water had gone and why. Houston is built on flat coastal prairie. The ground doesn't drain the way it does in other parts of the country. When it rains hard in Houston, and it rains very hard in Houston, the water has to go somewhere, and the somewhere is determined almost entirely by elevation and infrastructure. Our street, Briarwood Glen Court, sat at what engineers call a low point in a secondary drainage catchment. In plain language, we were at the bottom of a bowl. Water from 3 adjacent streets, Kellner Drive, Moss Crest Lane, and the parking area of the Briarwood Shopping Center 2 blocks north, all drained in our direction when the storm sewer system reached capacity. I had known this since I first looked at the topographic survey before buying my house. I had bought the house anyway because I understood the risk, and I believed it was manageable. The key word being manageable. Hurricane Harvey changed my calculations. In August 2017, Harvey stalled over Houston and dropped 60 inches of rain over 4 days. It was the most significant rainfall event in United States recorded history. Briarwood Glen caught flooded. Not catastrophically, not the way some neighborhoods did. We were not Maryland, we were not Friendswood, but we got 14 inches of standing water in the street, and 3 homes on the block took on water at the foundation level. Mine was not one of them, because my house sat on a slightly elevated pad compared to my immediate neighbors, a 2-inch difference that turned out to matter enormously. But I watched from my window during Harvey, and I made a decision. I was not going to rely on 2 inches of good fortune twice. Beginning in January 2019, I started designing a flood mitigation system for my property. I want to be very specific about what this was, because the HOA board would later try to characterize it as some kind of eyesore or construction project gone wrong. What I designed was a perimeter flood wall. Poured concrete footer, 8 inches wide, 18 inches high, finished with a smooth gray surface coat and a cap that matched the color of my existing driveway. Along the back property line, where it ran adjacent to my neighbor Ray Domings's fence, I designed a French drain integration that would channel any overflow into the city drainage easement at the back of the properties. The total visible height above grade was 14 inches, less than 1.5 feet. I had a licensed contractor price it out. I had a structural engineer review my calculations. I pulled a City of Houston building permit number BP 201904471, approved March 14, 2019. The city had no objections. In fact, Dale Hutchins, the senior engineer at the Harris County Flood Control District who reviewed my permit application, called me personally to tell me it was one of the better designed residential flood barriers he had seen submitted, and asked if he could keep a copy of my drawings for reference. On June 3, 2019, I submitted my modification request to the Briarwood Glen HOA. The packet I submitted was 42 pages long. It included my engineering drawings, the city permit approval, the structural engineer's letter of review, a materials specification sheet, a visual simulation showing what the finished wall would look like from the street, and a 3-page summary of the drainage catchment data for our street, including the flood risk analysis I had prepared using Harris County's own elevation data. I submitted it by email and hand-delivered a printed copy to Carol Hensley's house, where she accepted it at the door, looked at the thickness of it, and said, "I'll review it before the meeting." The meeting was June 17th. I arrived at the Briarwood Glen Community Room at 6:45 p.m. on June 17th. There were 14 homeowners present, plus the 3 board members, Carol, Dwight, and Susan. I took a seat near the back. The meeting ran through its standard agenda items: dues collection update, landscaping contractor renewal, a noise complaint about a resident on Kellner Drive who had apparently been operating a woodworking shop in his garage. After 9 p.m. then Carol said, "We have a modification request from Margaret Calloway at number 14. She looked at me. "Margaret, would you like to say anything before the board discusses?" I stood up. I had prepared a 5-minute summary. I explained the drainage catchment situation, the flood risk, Harvey's impact on our street, the city permit, and the engineering review. I kept it factual. I kept it calm. I was not there to argue. I was there to inform. When I finished, I sat down. There was a brief silence. And then Carol said, "Margaret, I appreciate the presentation, but I have to be honest with you. This is a residential neighborhood, not a construction zone." Someone at the table chuckled. Dwight leaned back in his chair with the particular body language of a man who has already made up his mind. "We're not engineers here," Carol continued, and that was when she laughed. "I mean, a flood wall in Briarwood Glen." She gestured around the room as though the tastefully painted walls were themselves evidence that flood walls were absurd. "Our neighborhood has drainage infrastructure. The city manages that. I don't think it's appropriate for individual homeowners to start building barriers along their property lines. It affects the visual character of the community. The city has already approved it," I said. "The permit is in the packet. The HOA guidelines," Carol said, "require board approval for any exterior structural modification, regardless of city permitting." "I understand that," I said. "That's why I'm here." "And the board's position," she said, "is that this is not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of Briarwood Glen Estates." Dwight nodded. Susan looked at her hands. The vote was 3-0. Request denied. I gathered my papers, thanked them for their time, and drove home. I sat at my kitchen table that night for about an hour. I wasn't angry, not exactly. I was something more specific than angry. I was the feeling you get when you have spent 31 years understanding something deeply and then watch someone with no knowledge of that thing dismiss it because it didn't fit their idea of how things should look. I knew what water did. I had seen what water did. And I had a city permit in my hand that said I was legally entitled to protect my property. The HOA guidelines were not ambiguous about exterior modifications. Board approval was required, but I had spent the previous 2 months researching exactly what the HOA's authority extended to, and here is what I had found. The Briarwood Glen Estates HOA CC and RS, specifically Article 11, Section 4, stated that the board had authority to approve or deny modifications that affected the exterior appearance of a home or its structures. However, Article 11, Section 7, which I suspect Carol had never read carefully, contained an exception. It stated that no HOA restriction could supersede a modification required for compliance with local, county, or state safety codes, and that modifications approved by the relevant municipal authority for purposes of safety or flood mitigation were exempt from board aesthetic review. I had not mentioned Article 11, Section 7 at the meeting. I had not mentioned it in my submission packet either. I had left it out deliberately because I had learned a long time ago that when you are dealing with a certain kind of authority, you do not show all your cards at the table. You wait until they are needed. On June 18, 2019, I called my contractor, a man named Eddie Vargas, who had been doing residential work in Houston for 22 years and who had poured more flood barriers than he could count. I told him the HOA had denied my request. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him to start on Monday. He said, "You sure?" I said, "Eddie, pull up Article 11, Section 7 of the Briarwood Glen CC and RS and read it." There was a pause. Then he said, "Okay, Monday it is." My neighbor Ray Domings came out on the second day of construction to see what was happening. Ray was 62, a retired postal worker, a widower like me, and one of the genuinely decent people on the street. He stood at the edge of my driveway watching Eddie's crew set the concrete forms and said, "HOA approved this." "HOA denied it," I said. "City approved it." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "After Harvey, I've been thinking about doing something similar." "Talk to Eddie when he's done with mine," I said. He nodded. "Carol's going to lose her mind," he said. "Carol," I said, "can read Article 11, Section 7. By July 20th, the flood wall was complete. It looked exactly like my simulation had shown. Clean gray concrete, 14 inches above grade, flush with my driveway on one side, tied into Ray's fence line on the back with the French drain running to the easement. From the street, it was subtle. It did not dominate the visual character of the property. It looked, if anything, like a well-constructed garden border. On August 12, 2019, I received a formal violation notice from the Briarwood Glen HOA. The notice cited Article 11, Section 4, exterior modification without board approval, and gave me 14 days to remove the structure or face fines of $150 per day. I read the notice twice. Then I drafted my response. My response was 4 pages long. It cited Article 11, Section 7 in full. It attached the city permit, the Harris County Flood Control District approval letter, Dale Hutchins's personal correspondence complimenting the design, and a legal memo I had requested from a real estate attorney named Patricia Okafor, whose office was on Westthamer Road, and who had reviewed the CC and RS and confirmed that the Section 7 exemption applied unambiguously to my flood wall. I sent the response by certified mail to the HOA's registered address and emailed copies to all 3 board members. Carol never responded. Dwight never responded. Susan never responded. The 14 days passed. The fines did not materialize. The violation notice was never escalated. And then September arrived. Tropical Storm Imelda made landfall near Freeport, Texas, on September 17, 2019. By the morning of September 19, it had stalled over the Houston metropolitan area and was producing rainfall at a rate that the National Weather Service described as historic even by Houston standards. I had been watching the forecast since September 15th. I had moved my car to a parking garage on Westthamer. I had sandbags staged at my front door as a secondary measure, though I believed the wall would handle the load. I had called Kevin, my son, who lived in Austin, to tell him I was fine and that he should not drive to Houston. I had a full pantry, a charged phone, and a rain gauge on my back porch. At 6:15 a.m. on September 19th, it started raining in a way that I can only describe as biblical. Not a storm, not a downpour, but a wall of water that hit the roof and the windows simultaneously and did not stop. I made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and watched. By 8:00 a.m., there was standing water in the street. By 9:30 a.m., the water in the street was 8 inches deep and rising. I watched it reach my flood wall. I watched it press against the concrete. I watched the French drain pull the overflow to the easement at the back. The water rose to 11 inches at its peak against the exterior face of my wall. It did not come over. It did not come through. My yard, my driveway, my garage, and my home stayed dry. I stood at that kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, and I felt something I do not have an easy word for. Not triumph, not satisfaction, exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when a calculation you made years ago turns out to be correct, and the correctness of it matters in a way that you always knew it would, but hoped it wouldn't have to. At 10:14 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID said Ray Domings. "Maggie," he said, "you doing okay over there?" "Dry as a bone," I said. I got about 2 inches in the garage," he said. "Nothing bad, I'm watching your wall from my window, it's holding like a champ." "How's the street looking?" "Bad," he said quietly. "Maggie, Carol's got water in her first floor. I can see it from here. Her front door is open and there's water coming out." I didn't say anything for a moment. "What about Dwight?" I asked. "Dwight's car is halfway up on his lawn," Ray said. "I think he tried to move it and it stalled out." We stayed on the phone together for a while, not saying much, just watching the rain. At 11:02 a.m. my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize. I answered. "Maggie." The voice was Carol Hensley's, and it was a voice I had never heard from her before, stripped of its authority, stripped of its composure. She sounded, for the first time in the 4 years I had known her, like a person instead of a title. "Carol," I said. "I have water in my house," she said. "I know," I said. "It's coming through the front door. I don't know what to do." I took a breath. "Carol, do you have a second floor?" "Yes." "Go upstairs. Stay there. The water will peak and recede. Don't try to go outside." "My furniture," she said. "Carol," I said, as gently as I could manage, "go upstairs." There was a silence. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She hung up. Dwight Prute knocked on my door at 11:45 a.m. He was soaking wet. He was 64 years old, and he looked, standing on my porch with water dripping off his jacket, like a man who had just had something very fundamental rearranged in his understanding of the world. "Maggie," he said. I opened the door wider. "Come in, Dwight." He stepped inside and stood on my entryway tile, dripping. He looked around my dry living room. He looked at my dry floors. He looked at the kitchen window where the rain was still coming down in sheets. "How did you do this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I built a flood wall, Dwight," I said. "I asked the board for permission in June." He looked at his shoes. "I know," he said. "I got him a towel. I made him tea. We sat at my kitchen table and watched the rain. He didn't say much. I didn't need him to." At 1:30 p.m., Kevin called from Austin. "Mom, I'm seeing Houston on the news." "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, baby," I said. My wall held. There was a pause. "The one the HOA told you to tear down?" "That's the one," I said. He laughed. It was the same laugh Robert used to have, short and surprised, the laugh of someone who has just been reminded that his mother knows what she is doing. By 4:00 p.m. on September 19th, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. By 6:00 p.m., the street was beginning to drain. The damage assessment on Briarwood Glen, caught in the days that followed, told the story in numbers. 7 of the 14 homes on the street took on water. 2 of them, including Carol's home at 22 Briarwood Glen Court, sustained what insurance adjusters would later categorize as significant structural damage. Carol's estimate came in at $71,000. Dwight's first floor sustained $34,000 in damage. Susan Albright's vehicle, a 2017 Honda CR-V, was declared a total loss after it was found 2 blocks away, having rolled down the street in the current and come to rest against a utility pole. My home sustained 0 damage. Ray Domings, whose property sat slightly higher than his immediate neighbors, sustained approximately $800 in garage damage that he repaired himself over a weekend. In the week after Imelda, 3 things happened in sequence that I did not expect, though perhaps I should have. First, Dale Hutchins from the Harris County Flood Control District called me. He had seen my address in the post-storm assessment data and noticed that 14 Briarwood Glen Court had registered no interior flooding. He asked if my flood wall had performed as designed. I told him it had. He asked if he could bring a team out to photograph and document it as a case study for a county flood resilience initiative he was developing. I said of course. His team came out on a Thursday and spent 2 hours measuring and photographing the wall and reviewing my drainage design. The following month, my flood wall was cited by Harris County as an example of effective residential flood mitigation in a report submitted to the Texas General Land Office. My name was in the report. My address was in the report. My engineering drawings were included as Appendix C. Second, a reporter from the Houston Chronicle named James Whitfield called me on a Wednesday afternoon. He was writing a piece about Imelda's impact on residential neighborhoods and had gotten my name from someone at the Flood Control District. We spoke for about 45 minutes. He was thorough and fair. The article ran the following Sunday under the headline, "How One Houston Engineer Flood-Proofed Her Home While Her HOA Said No." It was not a long article. Maybe 800 words, but it was accurate, and it named Carol Hensley as the HOA president who had denied the modification request. I did not ask James to include that detail. He found it through his own reporting. Third, the Briarwood Glen HOA held an emergency board meeting on September 28, 2019. I was not on the board and was not required to attend, but Ray called me afterward to tell me what happened. All 3 board members resigned. Not under pressure from the community, though there was pressure, 5 homeowners who had sustained flood damage had written formal letters to the board, 2 of them referencing my denied modification request specifically. They resigned, Ray told me, because they had sat down and read Article 11, Section 7, and understood for the first time what it said. And they understood that they had voted to deny a legitimate safety modification, sent a violation notice demanding its removal, and watched 7 homes on their street flood, while the home with the modifications stayed dry. And one of them at least had sat in that dry home drinking tea while his own floors were underwater. The new board was formed in October 2019. Its first act was to amend the HOA modification guidelines to explicitly recognize flood mitigation structures approved by municipal authorities as permitted modifications requiring only notification, not approval. Its second act was to void my August 12th violation notice and expunge it from my HOA record. Its third act was to send me a letter, signed by all 3 new board members, acknowledging that my flood wall had been a legitimate and lawful improvement to my property and thanking me for my patience with the process. I have that letter in a folder in my filing cabinet. I keep it not out of pride, though I would be lying if I said I felt nothing when I read it. I keep it because Robert would have gotten a kick out of it. He always said that the most underrated skill in engineering was patience. Not the patience to wait for things to happen, but the patience to do the right thing correctly and then let reality make the argument for you. I think about that a lot. Carol Hensley did not attend the October HOA meeting. She did not attend the November meeting either. In December 2019, I saw a moving truck parked in front of her house on a Saturday morning. I watched from my living room window as the crew loaded furniture, boxes, the contents of a life. At one point, Carol came outside in a heavy coat and stood on her porch for a moment, and I thought about going out to say something. I decided against it. There was nothing to say that the summer and fall of 2019 had not already said more clearly than I ever could. She left Briarwood Glen on a cold Saturday in December without ceremony, and I watched her car turn off the street and disappear, and then I went back to my kitchen and made lunch. My flood wall is still there. It is 9 years old now, and it is exactly as I designed it: clean, functional, unobtrusive, and effective. Every hurricane season I walk its perimeter and inspect it, check the French drain, look for any settling in the footer, make notes. It has performed correctly in every significant rain event since Imelda. The neighborhood around me has changed. 3 other homeowners on Briarwood Glen Court have built flood barriers since 2019, all of them approved under the new HOA guidelines. Ray Domings built his in the spring of 2020. He called me when it was finished and asked me to come look at it. I did. It was well done. I told him Robert would have approved. He didn't know Robert, but he smiled anyway. Here is what I want you to understand, and I mean this without bitterness. Because bitterness is a weight I decided a long time ago I was not interested in carrying. Carol Hensley was not a stupid woman. She was not even, I think, a bad one. She was a woman who had been given authority over something small and had confused that authority for expertise. She knew what a neighborhood was supposed to look like. She knew the rules. She knew the procedures. What she did not know, and what she could not know, because she had never spent 31 years watching water move through a city, was what was coming. And when someone who did know stood up and told her, she laughed. That laugh cost her $71,000 and her position, and eventually her home in the neighborhood she had spent years controlling. It did not have to be that way. All she had to do was read the packet. All she had to do was trust that a retired civil engineer who had spent 3 decades working Houston's flood systems might know something she didn't. But that is the thing about a certain kind of authority. It cannot afford to admit that someone else knows more, because the moment it does, the whole structure wobbles. I am 58 years old. I have buried my husband, and I have survived Harvey and Imelda and more storms than I can count, literal and otherwise. My house is dry. My wall is standing, and every morning when I walk past it on my way to get the mail, I think of Robert, and I think of Dale Hutchins calling to say my drawings were the best he'd seen, and I think of Carol Hensley laughing in that meeting room on June 17th, 2019. And I smile, not because I won, but because I was ready. Have you ever tried to warn someone about something, been dismissed or even laughed at, and then watched everything unfold exactly the way you said it would? Leave your story in the comments below. I would love to hear it. And if you are new here, welcome. This channel is for people who believe that patience, preparation, and knowing your rights are always worth it. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.